You guys, we're making this Regency inspired bustier. If you're new to my channel, welcome. I'm Tracy and I thrifted this silk blouse and my boyfriend actually picked it out. I fell in love with the color, so I was like, why not make a bustier out of it? I think everyone has watched Bridgerton by now, so I was really inspired by Daphne's undergarments and I wanted to do my own version. And all of the Regency stays, you can see that there's like Good Day inserts for the cups, but I wanted the stay to actually have cups. I have made a digital sewing pattern of this bustier and it will be available on my Etsy shop. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial and please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. For this project, you're going to need the sewing pattern and some fusible interfacing, as well as lining, your main fabric, and I also have an eyelet lace that I'm using, and of course matching thread in your sewing supplies. A bias tape maker, I'm making my bias about 3/8 wide, and some underwires. I recommend just taking an old bra that you have and just cutting out the underwires. A 1/4" spiral steel boning and a 1/4" spiral steel caps, and your tools, pliers, and wire cutters. Wire channel for your underwire is needed, about 1 yard. 2 yards of twill tape. This is going to be used for the exposed bone channels on the outside of the bustier top, and you're going to need about 6 yards of just lace-up ribbon. Take the sewing pattern and just cut out the number of pieces indicated on each piece. So for 1 and 3, I have 2 lace pieces, 2 main fabrics, and 2 lining. I fused the lining and the main fabric since I'm using a silk and a thin poly lining. For 2 and 4, you're going to cut out 2 main fabrics and 2 linings, and for fusible interfacings, and just fuse all 4 pieces. And for pattern piece number 5, you're just going to cut out 2 cups out of your lace right on that edge scallop, so it's already finished. I left one pattern unfused so I can show you how to apply it fusible interfacing. First, you want to just make sure your iron has the steam off, because you do not want to use any steam when you're applying fusible. And fusible interfacing, one side is completely smooth and the other side has these glue dots, so when you apply the iron, it just fuses to the fabric, so it just like sticks to the other piece, if that makes sense. So you just want to lay out wrong sides facing up, and then just place the glue dots of that pattern piece towards the wrong side. Take your iron and then just hold for 5 seconds and just proceed to continue doing that throughout the whole piece. As you can see, all the glue dots have melted and now this has made your fabric more structured. Repeat to the other side and then just do this to your main fabric pieces as well. You can also just fuse your fabric before you cut out all of your pieces. It does make it easier with silk, especially since it's very flimsy. Take pattern piece number 4 and just place right sides together, so face the main fabric towards the lining, and just pin the center back down and take it to your sewing machine. You're going to sew 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. After sewing the center back, you want to push the seam allowance towards the lining piece and do an understitch. This is going to make it easier for the fabric to roll underneath. And I'm just stitching a 1/16 of an inch away from that seam, so it's really close to it. That's what the understitch looks like, and it makes it so easy, so the lining just folds right under, and you just want to pin the center back down because you're going to do a 3/8 of an inch bone channel. I mark 3/8 of an inch with like chalk just so I know where to sew and where 3/8 is on my machine. So I'm just sewing 3/8 of an inch channel for the bone. I take my ruler and chalk and just mark 3/8 of an inch away from that stitch to create another channel, but this channel will be for the grommet placement. And I take my twill tape because I want an exposed decorative channel, so I lined it up right next to that chalk line. As you can see, I'm going to stitch on the very edge of each side so I can create a bone channel out of the twill tape. For pattern piece number 3, I have 1 lace, 1 main fabric, and 1 lining. So I first start off by placing the lace onto the main fabric so I can just line those up together and pin them down. So I'm just going to place the right side of the main fabrics together. So I'm just going to start attaching 3 and 4 like so. So I pin that seam down. And you can just baste that together first if it's easier for you, because you're just going to attach the lining. So you're going to place right sides together, as you can see, like that. And you're just going to pin all those layers together and sew 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. It's a lot of layers, so I like to just take the pins that are already in the other pieces and just move them while I hold all layers together and then just repin the whole thing, if that makes sense. I take it to the sewing machine and just stitch 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. After you stitch 3 and 4 together, you're just going to push both layers, sandwiching the seam allowance in between them, and you're going to sew 3/8 of an inch bone channel away from that seam. So just pushing all your fabric to the other side like that. And on the other side of that seam, I want to add some more twill tape to make another decorative channel. I take it to the sewing machine and just stitch right on each side of the twill tape to make another bone channel, and as I do that, I'm just making sure I'm lining up the twill tape right next to that seam and following that curve. You can also just skip the twill tape and just make another bone channel 3/8 of an inch away if you don't want the decorative tape. I really like how the contrast twill tape looks. So now we're going to attach pattern piece number 2 to 3. So we're just going to redo these steps, and you're going to take the main fabric and place right sides together like so, and just pin it down, and then place right side together of the lining and pin those layers down. So just sandwiching everything together, pin it all down, take it to your sewing machine and just sew 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. After attaching pattern piece 2 to 3, you're just gonna sandwich the seam allowance in between the lining and the main fabric and just pin it down so you can do the 3/8 of an inch bone channel away from that seam. And just repeat all of these steps to the other side, and the last piece we're going to sew together is pattern piece number 1. So take pattern piece number 1 and just grab the lining pieces, place center front right side together and just pin them down and sew 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. After sewing the lining, just press that seam open. Take pattern piece number 1's main fabric and the lace and just place them right on top of the pieces like so, and you can just baste both layers together if it makes it easier, but I just pinned mine at the center front. And next you're going to just take both layers and face right sides together and just pin that together and sew 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Press that seam open, and now you can start attaching pattern piece number 1 to the rest of the shell. So you're going to start by sewing it to the right side first. As you can see, I'm placing right sides together like so and just pinning it down. You can always baste if it makes it easier. I know it's a lot of layers, so I pin it down first, right side to right side, and then I take the lining and place right sides to right side so it's sandwiched like so. And I take it to the sewing machine and sew 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. After sewing 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, you can see how that is encased between the main fabric and the lining fabric, and your outside and inside look really nice. And I'm just pushing the layers away from that seam so I can do the 3/8 of an inch bone channel. I take the twill tape and add another decorative bone channel to the other side of that one like so, and now we're going to just finish attaching it to the other side. So place right sides together and just pin it down, and now you're just going to like bring everything together, if that makes sense, and like flip it so you can get the lining to the other side so everything's sandwiched inside, and then you're just going to sew 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. I know this is a bit confusing, but the seam will end up on the inside and your lining and your outside of the shell will be really nice and clean. So after you finish sewing that, you're just going to turn it right side out and look how nice it all looks. And you can just do your 3/8 of an inch channel away from that seam. After stitching down the bone channel, just take your decorative twill tape and just place it right next to that seam and just sew like you did the other side. Now we just have to add one more bone channel, and that's going to be at the center front. First, start by pinning your seams together so you can make sure it's completely lined up with the back seam and the front. So I like to pin it down, and I like to take a needle and thread and just baste it all together so it stays in place and nothing moves when I add the bone channel right on top. After basting the center together, just place your twill tape and sew on each side of it. After stitching it down, you can just remove the basting and just trim the ends. I like to make my own bias tape, but you can always buy some, and I start with an 1.5" strip. I like to overlock my ends because silk frays a lot, and this is my bias tape turner. I just made it myself. I'll link an in-depth video on how to make your own, and I just like stick the 1.5" strip in and just start folding to the finished width, which is 3/8 bias tape that I want. So I just start ironing it, and as I pull this, it starts turning the bias tape inward, if that makes sense. So I end up with like my own bias tape. After I made like a long piece of bias, I just open it up and pin it all around the hem of the bustier top. After I finish pinning that, I just take it to the sewing machine and sew 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. After sewing it, I just take the bias tape and just fold it up, if that makes sense, and then you just have like a clean binding at the bottom, and I just pin everything in place. When I get to each end, I just leave 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then I just fold it in and then up so it's clean finish end. Once everything's pinned at the hem, I just take it to the sewing machine and just sew 1/4 inch away from the edge, like so. Take another piece of bias and clean finish the top of the gore the same way we did on the hem. And don't make the mistake like I did. I forgot to put a bone channel in there before I clean finish this. So I'm not perfect. I made that mistake. Just make sure you put a bone channel. I'll go over how to apply bones in a bit, but yeah, just make sure you put a bone first. After clean finishing the gore, just grab your cup, pattern piece 5, and just gather from notch to notch on your sewing machine, and it's gonna look like that. And I'm gonna show you how to add a wire channel as well. So just take it to your machine and set it to a stitch size 5, and don't back tack, so stitch 1/4 inch away from notch to notch. After stitching from notch to notch, just pull on the back thread, and you can see the cup starts to gather until the bottom of the cup measures 8 3/4. I take the cup and just match right sides together. I start by pinning the center front, and then just start my way working around the cup and just pin everything and ease everything until it fits. Once the cup is pinned, you can just take it to your sewing machine and sew 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. I recommend basting it. It makes it easier to sew and you don't have the pins in the way. After sewing the cup, you can see it looks really nice, and you just have to trim the seam allowance 1/4 inch. And now we have to add the underwire channel. Take your wire channel and just cut a piece that is 8 3/4, and just place the wire channel right on top of that seam. So you're just going to push the seam up and just place it right on top of that stitch. I hope you can see what I'm doing, and then just pin it all the way around the cup. Once the wire channel is pinned into place, just take some thread and a needle and just start basting it in place. It just makes it so much easier to sew on the machine so nothing moves around. And make sure you pull the cup fabric up so you can get everything gathered evenly when you do the stitch. After basting the wire channel, I just make sure everything's laying as flat as possible. I take it to the sewing machine and just stitch on the very edge of either side of the wire channel. As you can see, there's a chain stitch right on the wire channel, and I'm just following that stitch and stitching right on top of it. So I'm just pulling the fabric up so I can make sure it's flat while it's stitching, and I'm just continuing to follow that chain stitch on the wire channel itself. And then when I sew the other side, I just sew a 1/4 inch away, and you can see I'm very close to the other side and stitching as close as possible. That's what the wire channel looks like all stitched. As you can see, it looks really nice on the outside as it does on the inside. Repeat to the other cup and remove basting stitches. This was when I realized I messed up and forgot to add the bone in there, so I had to just seam rip the binding on the top, and then I was able to fit a bone in. Before adding the bones in, I like to just mark the 3/8 of an inch from the neckline so I know where the binding's gonna end, and then I take my boning and then just measure from the top of that mark to the bottom of the hem binding. I mark that, and from that mark I just take my ruler and remove a 1/2 inch from that bone for ease, and I cut on that new mark. Take my bone caps and then I just place one right on top of the bone like so. I grab the wire cutters and just hold it into place. As I grab the pliers, I put pressure on both at the same time, and this secures the bone cap so they don't fall off. I repeat this to the bottom end of the bone, and those are your bones for your bustier, and just do double the amount of bones for the other side. I'm just applying them in between both layers of fabric, but for the decorative ones, it's just gonna go in between the main fabric and the decorative twill. When you get to the last bone by the cup, you want to leave about 1 inch of space because we're going to apply a grommet there. Take the 34B underwires. You can also use 32C depending on your cup size. So I'm just taking my underwire, and they're usually color coded, so the front is like beige and the side is white, so the shorter side goes up the center front, and I'm just feeding them right into the underwire casing. After putting in the wire channels, just do a zigzag stitch at the very top of the core on the wire channel just to close it. Take some bias tape and clean finish the armholes, but before you do that, just take your straps and place right sides together and sandwich the seams in, and then you want to bind the whole strap at once. I wasn't able to do this because I didn't have enough bias tape, so I was only able to bind the back piece. With the top I upcycled, I underestimated the amount of fabric I would have, but I made it work. I just overlocked the straps together and then just stitched them right on top, and I just covered the seam with some little bit of binding I had left over. I went to the garment district to get my grommets done. On the pattern I indicate all the placement, and I got a 1/4 inch silver grommets. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial, and thank you so much for watching.